Welcome to this presentation of concepts and misconceptions of LGPL and GPL installation obligations. The concept of installations obligations in an open source license is very much related to the ideas and even the philosophy of the author of these licenses. As you may know, Richard Stallman wrote the first versions of these licenses, and therefore we should have a quick look at the data of Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman, or correctly Richard Matthew Stallman, was born in New York in 1953. He is a physicist and a computer scientist, and he describes himself also as philosopher and as a passionate champion for software freedom. In the early 70s, in 71, while he still was a student at Harvard, he started working as a programmer at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. So even at this time, AI was already a topic. And later on, he launched the GNU project, GNU, GNU is not Unix project, with the goal of building a free software operating system. And he, as we know, claims that the today's available Linux systems that are mostly based on GNU software should rather be called GNU Linux. Soon after that, a year later, Stallman quit his job at MIT. And I think this is an interesting point because he was afraid that he could not have the full freedom on the software he writes at MIT because, as you know, employed at a company then gives the rights, the exploitation rights of the software to the employer. So he left MIT because of this. And we should also have a quick look at what focuses around freedom zero. At the beginning, there were only 3 freedoms. We will have later on a look on the freedom 1, 2, and 3. But the freedom 0, which is the freedom to do with the software whatever you want to do, is very important. And I remember that sometimes people claim that if Richard Stallman is such a progressive and social and modern person, he should probably forbid that, for example, software is used for military actions or so on. But no, he did not. And he's commenting on this by saying, since I'm not a pacifist, I would also disagree with a no military usage provision. I condemn wars of aggression, but I don't condemn fighting back. So no restriction to the open source software license under one of Richard Stallman's licenses with respect to military actions. And the other point is, could he not better restrict business? Could he not better say, well, you can use the software for leisure, for whatever, but certainly not for business? And then he has also a very clear opinion on this. He says, I'm not against business in general, so I would oppose a restriction against commercial use, a system that we could only use for recreation, hobbies, in school, is off limits to much of what we can do with computers. So the conclusion for him is very clear. A program must not restrict what jobs its users does with it. And this is freedom zero. So he tells us freedom zero must be complete. We need to stop torture, for example, but we can't do so through software licenses. The proper job of software licenses is to establish and protect users' freedom. So you have seen the term freedom was very often mentioned in these quotations of Richard Stallman. And just we mentioned freedom zero, we should also have a quick look at the other freedoms of these licenses. So the other freedoms 1, 2, and 3, of course, freedom 1 deals with the freedom to study how the program works and to change it so that it does what you want to do with the software. Freedom number 2, that you are free to redistribute copies so you can help others, and then even you can modify the code and then distribute the modified versions. So these are the other important 3 freedoms. But coming back to what we discussed today, freedom number 0 is very important. And I think to better understand the personality of Richard Stallman, who did a lot for us, without him we would not have all these wonderful sources for an entire operating system. And so he very much relates is to the personal approach to, if you want, to nature. Things like freedom and the expansion of knowledge are beyond success, beyond the personnel. Personal success is not wrong, but is limited in importance. And once you have enough of it, it's a shame to keep striving for that instead of for truth, beauty and justice. And I think he probably also meant for freedom. So if by some reason a person is gifted with certain gifts by nature, it's okay. This person may want to become the richest man on earth. That's okay. But it is completely out of importance. It is, according to Richard Stallman, important that these gifts are used to improve the science, to improve software, overall to make the world a better place. As kind of a requirement that we have to give back to nature. So to better understand why he wrote these licenses and why he is, for him, freedom is so important. We have a number of general public licenses. We have the GPL family and the LGPL family. The GPL number 1 was the first one already in '89, which contained more or less the principles of what we have, but today it is no longer used. Today, GPL 2.0 and 3.0 are heavily in use, for example, for the Linux kernel or for user space applications such as Bash. The LGPL started a bit later. We will later on discuss a bit why LGPL came out, why LGPL have an importance. And there's the version 2.0, which is also no longer in use. At this time, LGPL was used for library GPL, but at a certain time they recognized that it is a bit of a problem to call it library, because then everybody would use this only for libraries, but the idea is that it may be used for any other purpose. So this is why it was then modified, and L today stands for lesser. LGPL stands for lesser GPL. Less, we will later on see what is less. And then we have the version 3.0, which is pretty much connected to the GPL 3.0, as we will see. Let's have a quick look at the acceptance of these licenses. One way to do so is to look at the licenses at GitHub. There are many other ways to find out of how well a license is accepted, but well, just to have a comparison and an idea of how this can be investigated, we looked at the licenses per repository at GitHub. What you see here is that GPL 3.0 is highest, 2 million. GPL 2.0 is about 500,000, and then the LGPLs don't play a major role. When compared to the other copyleft licenses such as EPL and MPL, it's clearly visible that the GPL licenses are much more accepted. This picture changes a bit once we no longer compare to copyleft licenses, but we include some non-copyleft license, permissive licenses to the image. Then we will see that MIT beats them all, up to nearly 8 million. Apache 2 has more or less the same range as GPL 3.0, but while MIT is very popular, and it shows that there's a factor 4 between these two worlds. So it may be shows that if you feel that the GPL is dangerous, and some people feel it is dangerous, then, well, it probably is not that much of a danger. I think that all of you know pretty well what GPL and LGPL are, but let me have a very quick refresher on these licenses. The general public license, the GPL 2.0 and 3.0 are open source software licenses with an unrestricted, sometimes also called strong copyleft. What does this mean? Any modification or extension of existing files must be licensed under the original license. And new files with code that depends on original files or vice versa must also be licensed under the original license, at least when the old and the new material are supplied together. Strong, unrestricted copyleft. The LGPL, the lesser GPL, and now we know why it is lesser, it is less strong, sometimes people call it weak. We prefer to call it a restricted copyleft because for the files itself, it is not restricted. For the files itself of the project, it is same as GPL. So any modification or extension of existing files must be licensed under the original license. But new files that depend on original files may be licensed independently. So even licensed under a proprietary license, as long as the original and the new material can be separated from each other, or that they are provided as a linkable object, for example, for static linking. So this is a very important difference between the GPL family and the LGPL family. And then we should also mention that the LGPL has a very exceptional obligation. Normally, a license cares of the work that is distributed, that is made available. But the LGPLs care also on material that is not licensed under the LGPL. For example, under a proprietary license. So this license also imposes obligations on the otherwise independently licensed new material, which we will see later on. And then let's quickly have a look at a conception, or better I should say misconception, of the difference between GPL 2 and 3. We hear very often that people, when they are asked about what is the important difference between 2 and 3, they mention installation obligations. What you see here is we speak about non-difference. So people may have a different opinion, particularly in Anglo-Saxonian countries where the text interpretation of a legal text may work a bit different. But we here in Europe, we have a very clear idea about what the installation section of these licenses mean. Let's have a look at GPL 2.0. The source code for a work means the preferred form of the work for making modifications to it. Okay. For an executable work, complete source code means all the source code, evidently. For all the modules, plus the sources, of course, for all modules it contains, plus any associated interface definition, and now the important part, plus the scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. Well, it is not only the text itself, but it's also the spirit of the text that is something we look at. Why should a license require that you forward scripts to a customer if the customer can't use them? Is this the beauty of a script? Is this the aesthetics of a script? No. This is not conceivable that the idea is that you make available a script and you may look at it, but you can't use it. So the idea, the interpretation, the text interpretation of this section here in Europe, probably many lawyers will also share this opinion. This means that if you are forced to forward the script, you must also give the permission to use the script. And in version 3.0, the text looks a bit similar but also a bit clearer with respect to the installation. It says that only in case of a user product, that installation information means method, procedures, authorization keys and other information required to install. So I think that required to install is clearer with respect that this implies to give the permission for it. But when you compare these two wordings, then it looks like this is a clarification of this. So there's no doubt, well, there are some doubts in the world, of course, but we, in our concept, with respect to installation, we hold the opinion that there's no difference between the GPL 2.0 and 3.0. In both cases, you need to give the permission to the recipient of the software, if it's installed, to reinstall a new version because of the freedom. Because this is very deeply connected to the license. You do not provide the required freedom to your customer if you do not allow installation. So this is in line with the spirit of the license, this is in line with the ethics of the author, and this is also in line with what was clarified later on at the 3.0. So we feel that we should consider that installation is the same. Well, instead of creating a difference where we do not see a difference, there is a difference, and there is an important difference. And I think that sometimes people miss the important difference when they speak about the difference which we believe is not a difference. It is the duration of the source code disclosure obligations. Let's have a look at GPL 2. It says very clearly 3 years after the most recent public release. And then the requirement to make the source code available expires. In 3.0, well, I mean, already in 2.0, it was a bit of the problem with respect to freedom and open source and so on. So let's say that an embedded system has a lifetime of 10 years, 15 years, let's say even 20 years. Sometimes it may be 20 years. Then you have 3 years open source and 17 years closed source. So it was the very clear step to go to version 3, and in version 3 to have the duration of the source code disclosure obligations at least 3 years after the most recent public release, plus as long as the software is considered a product, which means as long as spare parts can be purchased from the original vendor or the vendor provides support. So this is an important difference, and I would propose that instead of looking at the other less clear difference, this is a clear and important difference. I would even say that a software project that contains it will be made available in binary form with a written offer, and it is containing 3.0 GPL, then it may be a better idea to not release the source code by written offer, but to convey it immediately along with the product. Because 10, 15, 20 years later, it may not be that easy to locate the complete corresponding source code of the product. So this is an important difference, and that should also be considered when selecting the way of how the source code will be made available. Well, let's go now to installation and the concepts and misconception about installation. First, we start with the GPLs. Well, to better understand what may happen, let's take a look at a realistic scenario. A manufacturer of a Linux-based router with secure boot is discontinuing support after 5 years, which may be okay. Shortly after, a vulnerability was discovered in the Linux kernel that allowed an attacker to gain access to the router by sending maliciously manipulated network packets to the router. But of course the Linux community has already released a patch, but the router is binary and the manufacturer has discontinued support, so the manufacturer will not make this patch Linux kernel available. So the idea of the license is that the owner of the router should be free to apply a patched kernel to the device, And well, this may even be important for sustainability reasons. And but because of all what we have just discussed about freedom, the license therefore stipulates that the freedom is granted to reinstall a new kernel version so that the router can continuously be used and must not be disposed of. Manufacturers may not like this idea, and they will raise a number of concerns, and we should have a quick look at these concerns, how they may in fact hinder to provide this permission to install new software. They may have the concern that safety regulations do not allow to permit individual installations. Same, of course, for security regulations that may not allow to permit individual installation. They may then claim that only a minority of users will ever be able to compile the Linux kernel and install it on the device, so this effort probably is not justified. They may then claim that a user normally lacks knowledge and procedures to ensure safe and secure operation of the patch device, so it may not work, or it may not work correctly, or may not work in a secure or safe way, so why should we do this? And of course, maybe this argument is not made so transparent, but users, and this is what manufacturers of course believe, must be forced to buy new devices from time to time to ensure innovation and keep the economy running. Or they may claim we need to encrypt the code to protect our IP. Or they may claim the device is ready for the market. Recently we have been informed about these installation obligations, but retroactively enabling installation will then set us back many, many months. So there are a large number of arguments why the manufacturer would not agree with this permission installation, with this permission to allow installation. So let's have a look. Safety regulations do not allow to permit individual installation. Yeah, but the safety regulations primarily protect users, recipients of a device, not manufacturers. Therefore, in certain markets, a device may not be given to the user if it is not properly certified, but given to the user, not be used. A person may apply modifications to a device that may violate safety requirements, but then use it on their own risk. This is not limited by safety or even by law. Accordingly, in Germany and in many other countries, self-injurious behavior or even suicide is not punishable. So if a person decides to modify the device and thereafter the device is no longer safe, may harm people, and the person who did the modification is then harmed, well, it's sad that people are doing such crazy things, but software license cannot protect a person from doing crazy things. This is what initially Richard Stallman claimed. So, in addition, as far as certification is concerned, the GPLs nowhere require that the device must be able to be certified for safety after the modification. And when we look to security, this is pretty much the same. Security regulations protect users, people who receive a device from a manufacturer, from a person or whoever who made the device, or he modified the device. This is why there are security regulations, and giving a device to another person and allow this person to use the device may require certification. On the other hand, same as with safety, a person may apply modifications to a device that violates security requirements and use it on their own risk. This is not limited, again, by security regulations or by law. And same as with safety, the GPLs nowhere require that the device must be able to be certified for security after the modification. It's on the own risk of the person who applied the modifications. Only a minority of users will ever be able to compile the kernel, so why should we do all this work to provide the sources and to let people reinstall it? Well, but this is good news. It is certainly not the responsibility of the original manufacturer to provide training or support. The only requirement is that the materials indispensable for reloading new software, such as scripts and keys and so on, are provided, and no contractual prohibitions on software reloading are imposed. That's all. If the person is unable to repair the unit, they of course can ask others for assistance. If they don't get support, bad luck. It is not the license that requires that the manufacturer helps people to modify the device, but it must not be by any method, by any legal rule prevented. Next one. A user lacks knowledge to ensure safe and secure operations, so this will never work. Again, it is not the responsibility of the original equipment manufacturer to provide training on safety and security. If the user feels that they cannot ensure safe and secure operation, they certainly are well advised not to make any changes to the device. If they do it, it is their responsibility. So this has nothing to do with a license regulation. You cannot, well, even by law, you cannot prevent people to do crazy things. And with licenses, you certainly cannot as well. Users must be forced to buy new devices from time to time. Well, at first glance, this may sound a bit strange to mention it here, but the entire list of concerns would not be complete without mentioning this. There's no question that cold discontinuation and planned obsolescence are parts of the toolbox of capitalism, whether we appreciate it or not. So it may not be an argument that people will tell you every day, but this may well be an important argument behind the doors. It is, on the other hand, hardly to be expected that the increasing use of open source software will change this. The distribution of GPLs, what we have seen before, just 2 million versus 8 million of MIT, is too low for this. And these licenses, in addition, and this is very important, are actually, when they are used, then mostly in conjunction with other proprietary software, which the manufacturer can discontinue at any time. So it probably is not that much of a danger that open source software, particularly GPL, will stop the economy from running. We have an example. For example, since September 1st of this year, many smartphones equipped with GPL licensed software for which update was discontinued are no longer accepted for electronic banking and must be disposed of. Fortunately for industry, users are forced to buy new devices, despite GPL, despite open source. So I don't think that we should too much be concerned about the use of open source software and that this will then reduce the mechanism to force people to buy new devices. Well, another important argument is encryption. People need to encrypt the code, for example, to protect the IP. And well, our argument when discussing this concern is that IP that needs to be protected is better not included in GPL licensed software. For example, if there is a decision making between to put such code into a Linux driver or to manage it in user space, then of course the recommendation would be to do it in user space, because user space programs that interact with the Linux kernel, as you know, may be licensed under a proprietary license, while the Linux kernel continues to be GPL licensed. So this is probably one way to get around this concern. And of course, what you can always do, instead of the entire image, encryption can be applied only to individual areas of the image, for example, to the proprietary software that is to be protected. So overall, this doesn't look like a very important argument. Yeah, and finally, enabling installation sets up back many months. The answer to this concern sounds very know-it-all, but it is no question that equipping a device with a mechanism to let users reinstall GPL licensed software is much easier if this is done from the very beginning of the device development than having to do so retroactively. And as you know, we, OSADL, we have worked on a policy template, and we can only recommend companies to implement a FOSS policy, and it should be part of a company's policy that whenever it is decided to use a particular open source software, and of course, even more importantly, if it's, for example, GPL with a large number of particular obligations, then the obligations should be evaluated and care taken to ensure that they can be met. If they don't have a policy, if nobody took care, and if after 2 years development someone discovered that the GPL may require some obligation, then, well, we can only say it's always a good idea to read the contract. But, well, this sounds we know it all, so sorry for this. But again, it's a good idea to, whenever you decide to use a particular software, look at the license and decide whether you are willing to fulfill the obligations. So I think, or we may discuss later on, and you may have another opinion, of course then it is welcome, but I think that we can tick them all. It doesn't look like there's a real reason not to use GPL in an embedded system in binary form, and to provide the source code of the open source part and to permit installation in the way as the GPL requires. Well, the LGPL is a more complex, a more difficult to fulfill license, but it is also connected to particular obligations that need to be looked at. So let's have a quick look at the LGPLs. Again, a refresher. What are these additional provisions? We already mentioned that there are additional provisions that do not relate to the original source code that is licensed under LGPL, but is connected to the software that is linked to it. And for the 2.0, Article 6 says that as an exception to the sections above, you may also combine or link a work that uses a library, which is very much wanted, which is very important, which is the reason why we call it a restricted copyleft, why we call it a weak copyleft. So the original files need to be licensed under GPL, but those that are linked to it, not. They can be licensed under any, even proprietary license. But then, if you do so, then this exception is only granted if you permit modification of the entire work for the customer's own use, remember, own use, and reverse engineering for debugging such modifications. And whenever we discuss this with companies who were not aware of this obligation, we got the impression that it's something that people don't take lightly. This is something that really requires a lot of discussion. But before we go into this discussion, let's have a quick look at 3.0 and what is the difference between those. Here we see something similar. You may convey a combined work, which is a work consisting of the original LGPL 3.0 library and a, for example, proprietary user space program that links to it, of your choice, licensed under your choice. That taken together effectively do not restrict modification of the portions of the library, which is not the entire work, but only portions of the library contained in the combined work, but then reverse engineering for debugging such modifications. So this is easier, although in many large embedded systems there's no choice. You cannot just select the license. There are a lot of libraries with GPL 2.1, so it is not that easy to just say, oh, we prefer 3.0. But in case you only used 3.0, then this is less difficult to fulfill if you want as the 2.1. Same as we did before with the GPLs. Let's take a look at a scenario that may happen. This is a scenario that involves LGPL, and let's assume that we are today in the year 2035. And we have a very old and long neglected 32-bit device that is still indispensable, and people believe that it will be used even after January 19, 2038. What is special with this date? If no measures are taken, the system will crash at this date, because on Unix systems the time is stored in a signed 32-bit variable that contains the number of seconds elapsed after January 1st, 1970 midnight. Unfortunately, it will reach its maximum on January 19, 2038 at 4 o'clock, 14 minutes, 7 seconds. So, well, you may decide to stay at a safe place at this time. And it will wrap to the smallest negative 32-bit number. And I think that people should, although it is still some time, but remember that we discussed that an embedded system may have a lifetime of 10, 15 or 20 years. So it may be already too late. So it is not a bad idea to have a look if this bug exists in your system or not. And we write a little test program. So we define the highest 32-bit signed number. We look for the length of the variable, either 32 or 64-bit. And then we call a function that converts this number into a string, so in month number, year, day number, and so on. And it probably will write the correct date, because this is a number that is still working. And then we use this increment function, which will add 1 to this number. And exactly at this moment when we add 1 to it, it will wrap and will then contain the smallest number possible to express in the 32-bit. And then we call again this conversion function and we let it convert. If everything works well, then nothing spectacular happens. Then simply the next line will also contain the year 2038 and everything is okay. But it does not contain 2038 but 1901, then it is not okay. So, and we let us run this program on an affected system. We will see the bit length is only 32, so it is too small. The first line is still okay, it's the highest possible number, and the next line is no longer okay. And you can imagine of how severely the system will crash at the time when from 1 second to the other second more than 100 years will have been passed for the system and it will crash. If everything is okay on a 64-bit system, then nothing special will happen. It just will display the next second and everything is okay. Some time ago we have installed these test programs on the OSADL QA farm, and we regularly run this program on the OSADL QA farm devices and display the result in the profiles. Well, in order to have a bit an idea about what the engineering level was about, the simple change from 32-bit to 64-bit has a considerable effect on when it happened next. Because I mean, now we change it in order to get around the problem at 2038. So we of course don't want to have the same problem another 100 years later. But this time we went to 64-bit, and this variable will only wrap in about 292 billion years, which is far more than the estimated age of the universe. So this is what I call safe engineering. Okay, now we have probably seen on this 32-bit system that the system is affected. And there's good news. On one hand, good news is that the C library, even the 32-bit version of the C library, has expanded the size of the time variable in such a way that 64-bit can be stored, so that the problem is fixed. But it requires knowledge, and it requires that the library is recompiled. And recompiling a library and replacing such an important language library like the C library, it's not an easy task. The time variable may be used by proprietary application and libraries. They may be changed. Bugs may have been fixed in the meantime, but there may be earlier workarounds on the system that are then obsolete and we need to remove them. But of course we can't remove them because we don't have the source code of the proprietary application. So to overcome the above challenges, it may be required to modify the proprietary application and reverse engineering it for debugging the modifications. Well, modify the proprietary application? Modify the proprietary binary application? Well, it's binary, and as we know, it is the important exception of the LGPLs that they do not impose the obligation to disclose the source code. How can a program in binary form be modified? Binary patching. Let's have a quick look of how binary patching may work. So for example, we may have a code section that starts with preparing the stack, then call a subroutine in the C library that was exchanged, and then evaluate the return value. So what we have to do in order to adapt the new function, we need to insert code here in order to consider changes in the call, and may also be important that we need to insert code here to consider changes in the return value. How would this work? We don't have any source code. We cannot recompile it. Well, there are some steps to do, and it was done. I know people, and even myself, we did it 20, 30 years ago. It is not impossible. So the first step would be to make the program a bit longer. You add empty space at the end of the program. We have these assembly instructions that we just have seen before, preparing the stack, calling into the library, receiving the return value, and continuing execution, and then returning from this part. So what we would then do, we would overwrite the code that needs to be extended with an unconditional branch operation, and we jump into this additional code section here. Then we write code here in this code section. We write new assembly instructions to make the modification. For example, to work with longer variables, for example, to modify, to convert variables, to adapt it, so whatever may be needed. And once this is done, we force the program execution to jump back to the original part and to continue. This is how binary patching works. Is binary patching still feasible? Well, at the time LGPL 2.1 was written, code was less optimized, and especially for complex instruction sets, binary patching was possible, although it always was rather tedious. Today, binary patching is usually no longer possible because binary code is normally highly optimized and reduced instruction sets architectures are more widespread available, are more common. And probably this is the reason why LGPL 3.0, as we have seen, no longer requires that the modification to the binary code of the proprietary application be allowed. It is sufficient to allow a modification of the library section. So yes, it is something that people may be concerned to give permission to modify a proprietary application only because it is linked to an LGPL library. But on the other hand, as you can see here, it is not very usual that there are people around who are able to do so, and it is probably also not something that we would ever recommend people to do. So let us conclude. Conclusion on GPLs. The GPL's obligations to allow and enable reinstallation of the software was not created primarily to annoy companies that decided to copy and distribute such software. It has a purpose behind, and the purpose of this regulation is rather to give the user of the software the greatest possible freedom and independence, in the same way as if the software had been delivered in source code form. And this may be probably an explanation why these installation instructions, the installation obligations are so important. Freedom to give the user the entire freedom. This is why we need to provide the user with source code. But what would the reason to provide source code if the user cannot install and run it? So the complete freedom is only obtained if we provide the source code and we allow installation. So in fact, these installation obligations, they do not add something. They just change the conditions between source code delivery and binary delivery. Binary delivery without installation permission would not be the same as source code delivery. So this may be an explanation why this is an integral part. It is not that we could remove this, but it would destroy the entire beauty and the entire concept of the LGPLs if we just remove this installation permission. For the LGPLs, it is a bit different. The LGPLs are additional obligations that relate to the linked proprietary software are also intended to give the user greatest possible freedom and independence. For the 2.0 library, that modifications to proprietary software must be permitted, for example, by binary patching, is now out of date. And this is probably the reason why it has been abandoned in LGPL 3.0. On the other hand, considering the fact that binary patching is hardly possible today and also not reasonable without seriously endangering the function of the software, it should actually not be a big hurdle to give this permission. And finally, after all, denying the permission certainly would not deter criminals from doing it. So, well, again, software and license per se cannot make the world a better place. Only human being, according to Richard Stallman, can, and so let's do it. Thank you.